Sometimes the things people laugh at are the very things they are afraid to understand. Cole Bennett stands at the back of a polished law office in Portland, Maine, with rain darkening the shoulders of his worn canvas jacket and Atlas resting silently beside his boots. At 38, Cole still carries the unmistakable frame of a man shaped by years of discipline, broad-shouldered, lean, his white skin weathered by salt, sun, and too many nights spent outdoors. Once, men trusted him with their lives. Once, he had been a Navy SEAL. Now everything he owns fits inside an aging pickup parked 3 blocks away. Everything except Atlas. The German Shepherd stays close, dark sable coat still damp from the rain, amber eyes moving calmly across the room. Around them sit relatives Cole barely remembers, people wearing tailored coats, polished shoes, and expressions that tell him they already know where he belongs. Eleanor Bennett is dead, and today her possessions are being divided. Cole almost did not come. Eleanor had been his father's older sister, stubborn, private, and kinder than she ever admitted. She had also been the last Bennett who still sent Cole a Christmas card even after he stopped having an address to receive one. The attorney adjusts his glasses and continues reading. Jewelry goes to one cousin. Investment accounts go to another. A house in Cape Elizabeth passes to Eleanor's niece. Then the attorney pauses. To Cole Bennett, I leave Blackridge Island, including its lighthouse, caretaker cottage, shoreline rights, and all property contained within its legal boundary. Silence holds for half a second. Then someone laughs. Cole does not turn. Another voice whispers, "She gave him that?" The attorney clears his throat. Blackridge sits roughly 6 miles off the Maine coast, an isolated patch of stone, spruce, and wind-beaten earth abandoned for years. Its cottage is deteriorating. Its lighthouse has been inactive for decades. The latest estate valuation lists the usable property value at $1. This time the laughter spreads. Cole lowers his eyes toward Atlas. "Guess we're landowners," he murmurs. Atlas looks up, but does not wag his tail. His ears have risen. Cole follows the dog's gaze toward a man standing alone near the far window. Gray suit. Expensive watch. No family resemblance. The stranger isn't laughing. He is studying Cole with the stillness of someone watching a door close. Then Cole notices what the man is holding beneath one arm. A folded survey map, its weathered corner marked with a name Cole has just heard for the first time. Blackridge Island. Atlas rises slowly. No bark. No movement toward the stranger. Just a low sound deep in his chest, quiet enough that only Cole hears it. The man meets Cole's eyes, folds the map once more, and slips it inside his coat. In a room full of people laughing at a worthless inheritance, Cole realizes one person isn't laughing at all. 3 years earlier, Cole Bennett still had an apartment key in his pocket, a steady paycheck, and enough certainty to believe that rebuilding a life was simply another mission. He learned otherwise slowly. After leaving the Navy, the structure that had carried him through years of service disappeared almost overnight. There were no morning briefings, no team waiting for him, no clear objective beyond getting through another ordinary day. He worked wherever someone needed dependable hands, unloading fishing boats before sunrise, repairing docks along the Maine coast, hauling lumber, fixing engines when the mechanics were overwhelmed. Cole never complained. At 38, he still woke before dawn, shaved when he had access to a mirror, kept his boots clean, and folded his few clothes with the precision of a man who refused to let circumstance decide who he was. But temporary jobs ended. Rent climbed. Savings thinned. One cold October morning, Cole placed the last cardboard box from his apartment into the bed of his aging pickup and handed the landlord his key. Atlas waited in the passenger seat. The German Shepherd had watched every trip down the stairs without making a sound, his dark sable head resting between the seats, amber eyes following Cole as though he understood that another door had closed. That first night, Cole parked near a public boat launch outside Portland. Wind came off Casco Bay carrying the smell of salt, wet rope, and diesel fuel. Rain tapped softly against the truck roof. Cole had $23 in his wallet, half a tank of gas, and 2 meals packed inside a paper bag. He opened the first container, divided the chicken carefully, and placed the larger portion in Atlas's bowl. "Do not get used to room service," he said. Atlas stared at him for a moment, then nudged the bowl toward Cole with his nose. Cole laughed quietly. It was the first sound of its kind he had made all day. From then on, they became a small unit of 2. Cole found work. Atlas waited. Cole found safe places to park. Atlas slept lightly beside him. On the difficult nights, when Cole stared through the windshield wondering how a man could travel so far and somehow end up nowhere, his hand would find the thick fur behind Atlas's ears. Inside the glove compartment rested one thing Cole never sold, an old brass compass that had belonged to his father. The glass was scratched, and the casing had dulled with age, but the needle still found north. Eleanor had given it to Cole after his father's funeral. She had closed his fingers around it and said something he remembered whenever life narrowed to a road with no destination. A man can lose his address without losing his way. Cole had not seen Eleanor in years after that. Pride made distance easy. Then distance became habit. Yet every December, somehow, a card found him. Eleanor never asked why he had disappeared. She simply signed each one. There is always a place for you. Now, sitting outside the attorney's office with Atlas beside him and Blackridge Island legally his, Cole turned the old compass in his palm. Across the rain-dark street, the stranger in the gray suit stepped into a black sedan. Before getting inside, the man looked back at Cole. Not with pity, not amusement. Recognition. Atlas stood immediately, ears forward. The sedan pulled away, tires whispering over wet pavement. Cole watched until the taillights vanished into the gray afternoon, then looked down at the compass. For the first time in years, he had an address. And someone already seemed to wish he did not. By sunrise the next morning, Blackridge Island was no longer a name on a legal document. It was a dark shape rising from the Atlantic beneath a ceiling of pale gray clouds, 6 miles off the Maine coast, surrounded by water that looked like hammered steel. Cole stood near the bow of a 30-foot lobster boat owned by Walter Hayes, an old dock worker who had agreed to take him across for the price of fuel and a promise that Cole would help replace 2 rotten boards on his pier. Atlas stood beside him, paws planted wide against the rolling deck, his dark sable coat lifting in the cold wind. The air smelled of salt, diesel, wet rope, and something clean that only existed far from shore. Cole pulled his jacket tighter and watched the island grow larger through the morning fog. Spruce trees leaned inland as if decades of Atlantic storms had taught them which direction survival required. Beyond them, on the highest ridge, stood the lighthouse. Its white paint had faded almost to gray. The lantern room was dark. Below it sat a small cedar cottage with a sagging porch facing the sea. Walter glanced toward Cole. "Your aunt kept people away from this place." Cole looked at him. "Why?" Walter shrugged. "Never asked. Eleanor was the kind of woman who answered questions by giving you another one." The boat eased alongside a weathered wooden dock. Cole stepped onto Blackridge with one duffel bag, a toolbox, a sleeping roll, and Atlas at his side. For several seconds, he simply stood there. No traffic, no voices, no landlord waiting for rent. Only waves folding against black rocks and gulls calling somewhere beyond the fog. Atlas moved first. He lowered his nose and followed the narrow path toward the cottage, stopping every few yards to study unfamiliar scents. Inside, dust softened the furniture and salt had clouded the windows. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner. A chipped coffee mug remained beside the sink as though Eleanor might return at any moment. Cole ran his fingers across the wooden table. Not exactly a palace. Atlas sneezed into the dust. Cole smiled. "Your review has been noted." By afternoon, he had cleared the stovepipe, found dry firewood beneath the porch, and discovered that an old hand pump behind the cottage still produced cold, clear water. The place needed work, but for the first time in months, Cole unpacked his duffel instead of leaving it ready to move. Night came early. Wind pressed against the cottage walls while the fire painted amber light across the floor. Cole spread his sleeping roll beside the stove and placed his father's compass on the table. Atlas should have settled near him. He did not. The German shepherd stood at the front door, perfectly still. "Atlas." No response. Cole opened the door. Cold air rushed inside. Atlas stepped onto the porch and stared uphill. Through the moving fog, the lighthouse appeared and vanished again. Its entrance was secured by a rusted chain and an old padlock. Atlas walked halfway up the path before stopping. His ears lifted. His nose tested the wind. Then he looked back at Cole. There was no fear in his amber eyes, only attention. Cole followed him to the locked lighthouse door, where Atlas lowered his muzzle toward the narrow gap beneath the weathered wood and inhaled slowly. A faint sound came from inside. Not a voice, not an animal. Something small shifted in the darkness, followed by a soft metallic tap. Cole placed one hand on the cold chain. The lighthouse had supposedly been abandoned for decades. Yet Atlas was staring at that locked door as though someone had left something behind and expected them to find it. The sound came once more from behind the lighthouse door, a faint metallic tick swallowed almost immediately by the wind. Cole kept his hand on the rusted chain while Atlas stood beside him, nose close to the narrow gap beneath the door. For a moment, Cole considered forcing the lock, but Eleanor had left him the island, not an invitation to tear apart everything he did not understand. "Tomorrow," he murmured. Atlas looked at him as though disagreeing, then finally followed him back toward the cottage. Morning arrived beneath a thin silver sky. The storm had moved east, leaving the Atlantic restless and bright under the first week's sunlight. Cole had just finished boiling coffee on the cast-iron stove when Atlas lifted his head toward the shore. Seconds later, Cole heard an engine. A sleek white boat rounded the southern rocks and approached the dock with the confidence of someone who already knew the water. The man who stepped ashore wore a charcoal coat over a gray suit. Cole recognized him immediately. The stranger from the attorney's office. Atlas moved beside Cole without being called. "Mr. Bennett," the man said as he approached. "Grant Holloway." He offered a hand. Cole looked at it, then shook it once. "You followed me 6 miles to introduce yourself?" Grant smiled. "I represent North Atlantic Development. We have been interested in Blackridge for some time." His eyes drifted toward the lighthouse before returning to Cole. "Your aunt was difficult to negotiate with." "She had that reputation." Grant removed an envelope from his coat. $75,000. Cash purchase. We handle closing costs, environmental review, everything. Cole stared at him. Yesterday, Blackridge had been valued at $1. Today, a stranger had crossed 6 miles of ocean offering $75,000. "What are you buying?" Cole asked. Grant gave a small laugh. "An island. I already know that part." The smile weakened. Wind moved through the spruce branches above them. Atlas watched Grant with unwavering amber eyes. "Coastal redevelopment," Grant finally said. "Private retreat, perhaps." Nothing decided. Cole folded the envelope without opening it and handed it back. "Then you do not need my answer yet." Grant studied him for a long second. "Places like this become expensive quickly. Repairs, taxes, boats, fuel. A man in your position might prefer certainty." Cole's face remained calm. He had heard pity before. This was not pity. It was pressure wearing good manners. "My position is standing on my property." Grant slipped the envelope back into his coat. Atlas stepped forward half a pace and inhaled. His ears sharpened. Grant noticed. Something changed in his expression, small enough that another man might have missed it. Cole did not. Grant turned toward the dock. "Think about it." By sunset, his boat was gone. The next morning, another envelope waited beneath a stone at the end of the dock. No boat. No footsteps Cole could identify. Just a typed offer for $200,000. Cole read it twice. Atlas stood facing the lighthouse above them. Cole followed his gaze toward the dark lantern room and remembered the folded survey map disappearing into Grant Holloway's coat. $1 yesterday. $75,000 today. $200,000 before breakfast. Cole folded the paper slowly and placed it in his pocket. He was no longer wondering why Eleanor had left him a worthless island. He was wondering what someone was afraid he might find there. By noon, Cole had stopped thinking about the money. $200,000 could have changed almost everything about his life. It could have replaced the aging pickup, paid for a small house on the mainland, and bought years without wondering where he and Atlas would sleep next. That was exactly why the offer bothered him. People did not pay $200,000 for $1 islands unless the dollar was a lie. Cole spent the afternoon searching the cottage without disturbing anything he could not put back. Eleanor had lived simply. Old wool blankets filled a cedar chest. Rusted tools hung above a workbench. Books about Maine tides, navigation, and coastal history lined 2 shelves near the stove. Atlas followed quietly until he stopped beside the kitchen wall. His nose moved along the baseboard, then rose toward a narrow section of paneling behind an old wooden chair. "What did you find?" Cole asked. Atlas scratched once. Cole moved the chair and noticed 4 boards that were cleaner than the surrounding wood. He pressed one. It shifted. Behind it sat a small leather satchel wrapped in faded canvas. Cole carried it to the table. The leather was dry and cracked, but the brass clasp opened easily. Inside lay a photograph, a brass key, and a folded piece of paper. The photograph showed Eleanor perhaps 40 years younger, standing near the lighthouse beneath a clear summer sky. Beside her were two men Cole did not recognize. All three stood beside a low stone structure near the northern shoreline. Cole looked through the cottage window toward that side of the island. There was nothing there now except spruce, rock, and ocean. He turned the photograph over. Eleanor's handwriting crossed the back in faded blue ink. "The tide keeps what men bury." Cole read the words again. Atlas rested his muzzle against the edge of the table, watching him. She never made anything easy, did she? The brass key was old, heavy, and marked with a tiny lighthouse symbol. Cole immediately thought of the chain door uphill. But before he could move, Atlas turned toward the window. His body became still. Then he hurried outside. Cole followed. The German shepherd crossed the clearing and headed north through wind-bent spruce, nose low to the ground. The path narrowed until the trees opened onto a rocky shoreline nearly 30 feet below the ridge. Waves rolled into dark stone channels, leaving white foam trembling between the rocks. Atlas stopped at the edge and stared downward. Cole took out the old photograph. Same ridge, same angle, but the stone structure was gone. He checked his watch and remembered Eleanor's tied books stacked beside the stove. The water below was rising quickly. Somewhere beneath those waves was the place shown in the photograph. Atlas suddenly moved several yards east and lowered his nose to a weathered iron ring embedded in the rock. Cole crouched beside it. The ring was almost hidden beneath moss and salt crust, but a length of old chain disappeared through a narrow crack toward the water below. Cole touched it. Cold, solid, deliberately anchored. A wave surged into the channel, covering the lower rocks. Whatever waited beneath them would remain underwater until the tide turned. Cole stood and looked back toward the lighthouse. The brass key felt unexpectedly heavy in his pocket. Eleanor had left him a photograph, a warning, and a locked door. And someone had already offered $200,000 before he understood any of them. The tide would not turn until after midnight, but the brass key did not require waiting. Cole stood beneath the lighthouse as evening settled over Blackridge, turning the old key between his fingers while Atlas watched the chained door. The wind had strengthened from the northeast, carrying the smell of rain and cold Atlantic water across the ridge. Cole slid the key into the padlock. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the mechanism clicked. The chain dropped heavily against the wooden door, and Atlas stepped forward before Cole could touch the handle. Easy. Cole pushed the door open. The air inside smelled of damp stone, rust, and old timber. A narrow staircase curled upward toward the dark lantern room, but Atlas ignored it. He moved across the floor with his nose lowered, circling once before stopping beside a warped section of boards near the western wall. Cole remembered the metallic sound from their first night. He knelt and pressed his palm against the wood. One board shifted. Beneath it, something tapped softly against stone. Cole fetched a pry bar from the cottage and carefully lifted the loose boards one at a time. Underneath was not earth, but an iron hatch with a recessed handle. The brass key fit a second lock. Cole looked at Atlas. Your Aunt Eleanor really believed in making people work for answers. The hatch opened onto stone steps, descending beneath the lighthouse. Cole switched on his flashlight and went down slowly, Atlas close behind. At the bottom stood a narrow room no larger than a storage cellar. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall. Wooden map cases filled another. A work table sat beneath shelves crowded with sealed document boxes. Everything had been raised several inches above the floor to protect it from moisture. Cole brushed dust from the nearest box. Eleanor Bennett. Property records. Inside were survey maps dating back decades, handwritten correspondence, photographs of Blackridge, and copies of coastal deeds. One map showed the island divided by carefully measured lines extending beyond the visible shoreline. Another marked the northern ridge where the missing stone structure had once stood. Cole unfolded a letter from Eleanor to a state land surveyor. The language was formal, but one sentence caught him. She disputed an altered boundary description connected to a proposed private development. Cole opened another folder. North Atlantic Development appeared again. Older documents carried a different company name, but the mailing address matched the one printed on Grant Holloway's offer. Cole felt the room grow smaller. This had not begun with him. Eleanor had been protecting something for years. Atlas suddenly moved to the far cabinet and sniffed along its bottom drawer. Cole opened it. Empty. Unlike the others, there was no dust inside. A paper label remained on the front. Original shoreline survey and supporting deed. Cole stared at the clean metal, then at the dust-covered records around it. Someone had removed that folder recently. Atlas lowered his nose to the floor and followed a faint trail toward the stairs. Cole raised his flashlight. Near the hatch, pressed into the dust, was the partial outline of a shoe. The hidden room had stayed sealed for years, but not untouched. By 11 that night, the rain had returned, soft at first, then steady enough to blur the lighthouse behind silver curtains of water. Cole sat at Eleanor's table with the copied survey maps spread before him and the empty folder label fixed in his mind. Original shoreline survey and supporting deed. Someone had known exactly what to remove. Yet something bothered him more than the missing papers. Eleanor had hidden an entire archive beneath a locked lighthouse, protected it for years, and left clues inside the cottage. A woman that careful would never keep the one document that mattered most beside everything else. Atlas suddenly rose from the stove and walked to the door. Again? Cole asked. The German shepherd looked back once. Cole checked Eleanor's tide book. Low tide was less than 40 minutes away. He slipped the brass key and his father's compass into his jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and followed Atlas into the rain. They crossed the northern ridge beneath a sky without stars. The Atlantic sounded different at low tide, farther away but somehow larger, breathing through channels that had been underwater hours before. Atlas reached the iron ring they had found earlier and continued down a narrow slope, now exposed between the rocks. Cole followed carefully. 20 feet below, the retreating water had revealed a shelf of black stone covered in seaweed. The old chain descended toward it and disappeared behind a boulder. Atlas ignored the chain. He moved farther east, sniffing along a crack in the cliff until he stopped beneath a shallow stone ledge. His paws scraped wet gravel. There. Cole crouched beside him. Atlas pushed his muzzle deeper beneath the ledge and gave one short bark. Cole reached into the narrow space and felt metal. He pulled out a weatherproof case, dark green, scratched by years of salt but sealed tight. For several seconds, he simply held it while rain ran from his sleeves. Eleanor had not hidden this beneath the lighthouse. She had hidden it where the island itself guarded it twice every day. Back at the cottage, Cole dried the case and opened it beneath the warm glow of an oil lamp. Inside lay an original survey bearing state seals, an older deed, several photographs, and a thick envelope with his name written across the front. Cole opened the survey first. The boundaries were different from the copies in the lighthouse. Blackridge included a protected deep-water inlet on its northern side and an easement controlling access across a surrounding stretch of shoreline. Attached correspondence showed that developers had tried for years to acquire those rights because they were essential to a proposed marina project on neighboring coastal property. Without Blackridge, the project could not move forward as planned. $200,000 suddenly made sense. So did the laughter. So did Grant Holloway's urgency. Cole unfolded the deed. A handwritten note from Eleanor was clipped to it. Copies can disappear. Truth should have more than one hiding place. Cole smiled faintly. Then he opened the envelope bearing his name. The letter inside was shorter than he expected. Eleanor wrote that she had watched companies place money before people and convenience before promises. She had refused every offer, not because Blackridge could make her rich, but because once sold, it could never be protected in the same way again. Then came the line that made Cole stop. I did not leave this place to you because you had nowhere else to go. I left it to you because you know what it means to have something taken from your life and still refuse to become bitter. Cole lowered the letter. Across the room, Atlas rested his chin on the table beside the old compass. Eleanor's final words waited near the bottom. A home is not valuable because someone wants to buy it. It is valuable because someone chooses to protect what belongs there. For a long moment, only rain and the quiet ticking of the stove filled the cottage. Cole looked at the original deed, then at the dog who had led him to it. Grant Holloway had believed the missing folder would leave Blackridge defenseless. Eleanor had known better. And now, so did Cole. 3 days later, Cole walked into the same Portland law office where people had laughed at Eleanor's final gift. This time Atlas moved beside him with quiet purpose, and beneath Cole's arm was a weatherproof case containing copies of every document they had found. The originals were already secured with Eleanor's attorney, Margaret Hale, a careful woman who had spent 2 days comparing deeds, surveys, correspondence, and county records before making several calls Cole was not permitted to hear. Her conclusion had been simple. Blackridge was not worthless. More importantly, the discrepancies were serious enough to require formal review. Grant Holloway arrived 20 minutes later with 2 attorneys and none of the easy confidence he had carried onto the island. He sat across from Cole at the long walnut table while Margaret explained that the original shoreline survey had been preserved, along with supporting records documenting Blackridge's northern easement and deepwater access rights. Grant's expression barely changed, but his fingers stopped moving. Margaret continued. Copies of the records had been submitted to the appropriate state and county offices for verification, and any development proposal dependent on disputed boundaries would remain subject to that process. Silence settled over the room. Cole remembered the laughter from the first meeting. Strange how quickly people became quiet when something they dismissed gained a voice. One of Grant's attorneys slid a folder across the table. North Atlantic Development is prepared to offer Mr. Bennett $1.8 million for the property, contingent upon a clean transfer. Cole did not touch it. Another folder followed. We are authorized to increase that to $2.4 million. Atlas lay beside Cole's chair, calm now, his amber eyes half closed. Cole looked toward the rain streaking the windows. $2.4 million. A few weeks earlier, he had slept in a pickup and counted dollars before buying fuel. He thought about a warm house, a reliable truck, years without uncertainty. Then he remembered Eleanor's handwriting. A home is not valuable because someone wants to buy it. Grant leaned forward. Mr. Bennett, this is more money than that island will ever earn you. Cole finally looked at him. Maybe earning money is not what it is for. Grant exhaled slowly. Then what do you want? Cole rested one hand on Atlas's shoulder. For the records to be corrected, for the shoreline rights to remain with Blackridge, and for whatever happened before I inherited it to be reviewed properly. No anger, no victory in his voice, just certainty. Margaret closed the offer folder and returned it across the table. In the weeks that followed, surveyors confirmed Eleanor's original boundaries. Officials began reviewing the conflicting filings and the development applications connected to them. North Atlantic Development withdrew its immediate proposal while that process continued. Cole did not celebrate. He went back to Blackridge. The morning he returned, the sea was calm enough to reflect the lighthouse in broken silver. Atlas jumped from the boat first and trotted toward the cottage as though he had always belonged there. Cole followed with his duffel over one shoulder. On the porch, he stopped and looked at the weathered roof, the crooked railing, and the chimney that still needed mortar. $2.4 million could have bought him almost any address he wanted. Instead, he took his father's compass from his pocket, watched the needle settle north, and opened Eleanor's old front door. For the first time, walking away from money did not feel like losing something. 1 year later, the first thing visitors noticed about Blackridge was not the lighthouse. It was the sound of dogs running down the dock. Atlas always led them, his dark sable coat touched with a little more silver around the muzzle, his amber eyes still bright whenever a boat approached. Behind him came retired working German shepherds that had spent years serving beside people and now spent their mornings chasing gull shadows across the grass, sleeping beside the stove, and learning that not every day required a mission. Cole had given Blackridge one anyway. The cottage no longer leaned against the wind. Its roof was repaired, the porch stood straight, and warm light filled the windows after sunset. 2 additional cabins sat among the spruce trees, built mostly by Cole and volunteers from the mainland. Nothing was luxurious. That was never the point. The cabins offered quiet, temporary shelter for veterans trying to find their footing after difficult seasons of life. Some stayed for 3 days. Some stayed for 3 weeks. Nobody was asked to explain more than they wanted. There was coffee before sunrise, work when hands needed something useful to do, and enough silence to remember that silence did not always mean loneliness. Cole understood that better than most. The legal review surrounding Blackridge had taken months. The original boundaries Eleanor preserved were formally recognized, and the questionable records connected to the proposed development were corrected through the proper process. North Atlantic Development moved on. Other buyers came afterward. Some offered even more money. Cole kept every letter in a drawer beneath the kitchen counter, unopened after the first page. He had already made his decision. On a clear October evening, Cole sat on the restored porch while the Atlantic turned copper beneath the setting sun. Atlas lowered himself beside him with the slow dignity of a dog no longer interested in pretending he was young. Cole smiled and scratched behind his ears. "Getting old on me, buddy." Atlas rested his head against Cole's knee. Beyond them, one of the visiting veterans was repairing a section of fence with another man he had barely spoken to when he arrived. Near the lighthouse, two retired German shepherds slept in the grass. Somewhere inside the cottage, a coffee pot clicked off. Ordinary sounds. Small things. Cole reached into his jacket and removed his father's brass compass. The casing was still scratched. The glass was still cloudy at the edge. The needle still found north. He placed it on the porch between himself and Atlas and looked toward the lighthouse. Eleanor had left him land everyone else measured in dollars. Atlas had found the truth hidden beneath stone, salt, and years of silence. But neither of those things was the miracle Cole remembered most. A year earlier, everything he owned had fit inside a pickup. Now people arrived on Blackridge carrying that same hollow look he once saw in his own reflection, and sometimes they left standing a little straighter. Cole watched the final sunlight settle across the water. He had thought a home was the place where a man finally stopped being asked to leave. He understood it differently now. A home was the place where, after finding shelter yourself, you opened the door and made room for someone else. Atlas breathed softly against his knee. Cole rested his hand on the dog's head. And as the lighthouse cast its quiet beam across the darkening Atlantic, neither of them needed another mission.